Dorothy Merritt had always believed that at 74 years old, the most she could expect from the children she'd raised and sacrificed everything for was simple decency. A hand extended, a door left open, a voice that said you matter. Instead, she received an eviction notice, 3 turned backs, and the hollow sound of her own footsteps on an empty sidewalk, carrying nothing but a single suitcase and a rusted key her dying mother had pressed in her palm nearly 45 years ago, whispering words Dorothy had almost forgotten. Go to the cellar when you have nothing left. I put something there that will save you. And so, with nowhere left to turn and no one left to call, Dorothy walked 3 miles down a crumbling road toward an abandoned property, toward a locked cellar that hadn't been opened in decades, toward a truth so powerful it would bring the most respected man in Cedarbrook, Virginia, to his knees before the week was over. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of October 3rd began like most difficult mornings in Dorothy Merritt's recent life, gray, quiet, and carrying the particular heaviness of something irreversible approaching. She'd been awake since 4, sitting at the small kitchen table in the house she'd rented for 19 years, drinking tea that had gone cold without her noticing, watching the pale light slowly fill the window above the sink. She was 74 years old, and by noon she would have no home. The house itself was nothing remarkable, a modest single-story rental on the edge of Cedarbrook, Virginia, with thin walls and a porch that slanted slightly to the left, and a garden out back that Dorothy had quietly transformed over 19 years into something genuinely beautiful. Roses along the fence line, lavender in neat rows beside the back steps, a small vegetable patch that had fed her reliably through every summer since Frank had passed. It wasn't grand. It had never been grand, but it had been hers in every way that felt real and meaningful. The place where her routines lived, where her memories gathered, where she had managed, despite everything, to build a quiet and dignified life on almost nothing. The landlord who had allowed her to stay, a soft-spoken elderly man named Walter Greer, had been the kind of person who still believed that a handshake meant something. He'd told Dorothy when she first moved in that she could stay as long as she needed, that he had no interest in squeezing money out of people who were good tenants and decent human beings. Dorothy had been both. She had paid her rent without fail every single month for 19 years, had maintained the property carefully, had reported every repair needed promptly and without complaint. Walter had told her more than once that she was the best tenant he'd ever had. But Walter Greer had died in February, quietly, in his sleep at the age of 89. And his son, a man named Brett who lived in Atlanta and visited Cedarbrook perhaps twice a year, had looked at the property not as someone's home, but as an asset to be liquidated. Within 6 weeks of his father's passing, Brett had sold the house to a development company that intended to tear it down as part of a larger commercial project along that stretch of road. Dorothy, who had no formal lease, only Walter's word and 19 years of faithful tenancy, had no legal standing to fight the sale. She'd been given 60 days to vacate, which had felt generous until the 60 days actually arrived, and she still had nowhere to go. Her children could have helped her. This was the thought she kept returning to in the gray morning quiet, not with bitterness exactly, but with a clarity that felt like something solidifying inside her chest. Gregory, her oldest at 51, was a successful financial advisor with a 4-bedroom house and a guest room that sat empty most of the year. Carol, 49, owned a spacious townhouse in Roanoke and worked from home 3 days a week. Philip, her youngest of 46, had recently moved into a newly renovated home with his wife and their teenage son. Any one of them could have offered her temporary shelter while she found a solution. Together, they could have hired a lawyer to at least explore her tenant rights, could have helped her navigate applications for senior housing, could have driven her to viewings, made calls on her behalf, co-signed a lease. Instead, they had held a family meeting without inviting her and reached a collective conclusion that the most practical solution was a managed care facility. They had presented this to Dorothy 3 weeks before her eviction date with the careful, patient tone of people explaining something obvious to someone who was struggling to understand. It's not about not wanting you around, Mom. Gregory had said, his hands folded on the table in a way that reminded Dorothy uncomfortably of someone conducting a business negotiation. It's about making sure you're properly looked after. These facilities are designed exactly for this situation. Dorothy had told them she had applied to every senior housing option within 40 miles of Cedarbrook, that every single one had a waiting list, that the shortest wait time she'd been quoted was 8 months, and most were well over a year. Carol had sighed in a way that communicated more than any words could have. Then you should have started this process earlier, Mom. We told you months ago this was coming. There was nothing left to say after that. Dorothy had understood in that moment, with the quiet certainty of someone finally seeing something they'd long suspected, that her children had already moved on from her. Not with cruelty, exactly. They were not cruel people, but with the particular indifference of adults who had built their lives so completely around their own comfort that there was simply no room left for inconvenience. And Dorothy, at 74 and homeless, had become an inconvenience. And so, on the morning of October 3rd, she sat with her cold tea and her single-packed suitcase, waiting for the sound of her children's cars in the driveway, already knowing that when they came, they would not be coming to save her. They would be coming to watch her go. Gregory arrived first, at 9:30, pulling into the driveway in his silver SUV with the quiet efficiency of someone who had scheduled this into his calendar between 2 other appointments. He didn't knock. He had a key, one Dorothy had given him years ago for emergencies, and he let himself in without hesitation, moving through the small house with the brisk energy of someone assessing square footage rather than saying goodbye to a place his mother had lived for 19 years. "The moving company will be here at 11, he said by way of greeting, not quite meeting Dorothy's eyes. "They'll take whatever you're donating directly to the church thrift store. I've already arranged that." Dorothy noticed he said, "donating rather than your things," as if the decision about what happened to her belongings had already been made by someone other than her. Carol arrived 20 minutes later with Philip close behind, and the 3 of them moved through the house with a coordinated purposefulness that told Dorothy they had discussed this beforehand, had divided responsibilities, had organized the erasure of her home with the same efficiency they brought to everything else in their lives. Carol handled the kitchen. Philip managed the small back bedroom Dorothy had used as a sewing room. Gregory supervised the living room and directed the movers when they arrived, pointing at furniture with the authoritative confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. Dorothy sat in the garden for most of it. She couldn't watch, couldn't stand in her own kitchen and observe strangers carrying her life out through the front door in cardboard boxes. So she sat on the old wooden bench beside the lavender she'd planted 8 years ago, and she breathed, and she tried to stay steady inside the particular grief of losing a place that had held you. She thought about Frank. She often thought about Frank in moments that required steadiness, because Frank had been the steadiest person she'd ever known. Francis Gerald Merritt. Carpenter, quiet man, the kind of husband who fixed things without being asked and listened without interrupting and made you feel, simply by being in the same room, that whatever was happening could be managed. They'd had 26 years together before the cancer took him, and Dorothy had spent the 11 years since his death learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to be steady on her own. Frank had grown up in Cedarbrook. His family had deep roots there. 3 generations of Merritts who'd built things with their hands and worshipped at Cedarbrook Baptist and been known throughout the county as honest, hard-working people. Dorothy had come to Cedarbrook from outside, which in a town like that meant something. She'd arrived at 31 with a seamstress's skill and a quiet history that she'd learned very early not to discuss, because discussing it in Cedarbrook inevitably led back to Victor Aldrich. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Victor Aldrich was 62 years old now, and still the most powerful man in Cedarbrook. He'd been powerful for as long as Dorothy could remember. The kind of power that came not from a single position or title, but from accumulated influence, from sitting on every important board and committee in the county, from being the man whose endorsement could make a business succeed or fail, whose disapproval could close doors that no one else could open. He'd inherited a construction company from his father, expanded it into a regional enterprise, and used the wealth and connections it generated to position himself as an indispensable community pillar. Schools named buildings after him. The local paper quoted him on matters of civic importance. People shook his hand with visible gratitude. Dorothy had never shaken his hand. Not once. Not in 40 years. She pushed the thought of Victor Aldridge away deliberately, the way she always did, pressing it back down into the locked place inside her, where she kept everything from that period of her life. She had learned long ago that thinking about it too directly cost more than it returned. There was no justice in turning it over endlessly in her mind. There was only the weight of it, which she carried quietly, as she had carried everything else. "Mom." Philip was standing at the garden gate, his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at her with an expression she recognized as guilt dressed up as concern. "The movers are almost done. You need to decide where you're going." Dorothy stood from the bench slowly, feeling the particular stiffness in her knees that cold mornings always brought now. She looked around the garden one final time, the roses, the lavender, the small vegetable patch going brown at the edges with the seasons turning, and she felt something settle inside her that was not quite acceptance, but was close to it. "I know where I'm going," she said. Philip frowned slightly. "Mom, you don't seriously still think." "Your grandmother's property," Dorothy said clearly. "Agnes's old place. There's a cellar built into the hillside on the back of the land. It's solid. It's still standing. I'll go there." The look that passed between Philip and Gregory, who had appeared at the back door, was the look of people humoring someone they had already written off. "That land hasn't been touched in years," Gregory said carefully. "There's no electricity out there, no running water. You can't seriously intend to." "I'm not asking your opinion," Dorothy said simply. "I'm telling you where I'll be." She picked up her suitcase from beside the bench, took one last look at the lavender she would not see bloom again next spring, and walked through the garden gate without looking back. The walk to Agnes Calloway's old property was just under 3 miles, following a route Dorothy had not taken in decades, but remembered with the particular precision of paths walked during formative years. Out of Cedarbrook proper, past the old feed store that had become a coffee shop and then an empty storefront, past the Lutheran church with its perpetually peeling white paint, down the long county road that narrowed gradually as the town thinned out into farmland and tree line and the particular quiet of rural Virginia in early October. Dorothy walked slowly, her suitcase rolling behind her on the uneven asphalt, her coat pulled close against a wind that carried the first real edge of autumn cold. Her knees protested the pace, as they always did now, but she was not a woman who had ever let discomfort make her decisions for her. She walked, and she breathed, and she let the familiar landscape settle around her like something she had needed without knowing it. She thought about Agnes as she walked. Her mother had been a complicated woman, not warm in the effortless way some mothers were warm, not demonstrative or given to easy affection, but deeply and fundamentally devoted in ways that had taken Dorothy most of her adult life to fully recognize and appreciate. Agnes Calloway had raised Dorothy alone after Dorothy's father left when Dorothy was 4, working as a bookkeeper for 3 different small businesses simultaneously, keeping them fed and housed and clothed through sheer disciplined determination. She had not been a woman who said, "I love you" easily, but she had been a woman who showed up completely and consistently, and Dorothy had come to understand that this was its own profound language of love. Agnes had died 11 years ago at the age of 83, 2 months after Frank, which had left Dorothy simultaneously widowed and motherless in a single devastating season. The property, 22 acres outside Cedarbrook that Agnes had owned outright, purchased somehow through decades of careful saving, had passed into a family trust shared among Dorothy and her 2 older brothers, both of whom lived out of state and had shown no interest in the land beyond its presence on a balance sheet. The old farmhouse had burned down 14 years ago in an electrical fire, leaving nothing but a stone foundation slowly disappearing beneath encroaching vegetation. Nobody had visited in years. Nobody had seen any reason to. But the cellar had been built separately from the house. Agnes's particular addition, dug into the hillside behind where the farmhouse had stood, constructed from mortared stone and heavy timber with the solid, unhurried craftsmanship of someone building something meant to outlast the builder. Agnes had called it her thinking place, her quiet corner, the one space on the property that was entirely and uncomplicatedly hers. Dorothy had visited it perhaps a dozen times during her childhood and young adulthood, always with Agnes, always with the sense that she was being admitted into something private and significant. The last time had been 45 years ago, 3 weeks before Agnes's health had begun its final decline, when Agnes had taken Dorothy's hand with surprising firmness and pressed a small iron key into her palm. "Keep this," Agnes had said, her voice carrying the particular weight of someone making arrangements. "And remember, if you ever find yourself with nowhere left to turn, go to the cellar. I'll put something there for you, something that will matter when you need it." Dorothy had assumed at the time that it was the sentiment of an aging woman preparing for death, the kind of thing people said when they wanted to feel they were leaving something behind. She had kept the key on a hook beside her bathroom mirror for years, then transferred it to a small tin box in her dresser drawer, then finally tucked it into the inner pocket of her winter coat where it had lived, forgotten and unforgotten simultaneously, for the better part of 2 decades. She reached in her coat pocket now as she walked and felt it there, small and iron and cold, worn smooth at the bow from years of handling. She closed her fingers around it and kept walking. The property appeared gradually through the tree line, the way places return in reality after years of existing only in memory, smaller than remembered, wilder than imagined, but unmistakably itself. The stone foundation of the old farmhouse was barely visible beneath a tangle of bramble and young birch trees that had taken enthusiastic root in the years since the fire. Nature had reclaimed the cleared land around it with the patient thoroughness of something that understood it had all the time in the world. Dorothy moved around the foundation carefully, following the slope of the hillside upward and behind where the house had stood, and there it was, the cellar entrance, set into the hillside exactly as she remembered. A heavy wooden door mortared into the stone, weathered deeply by decades of exposure, moss covering the lower third of it in a thick green carpet. A rusted iron handle, a padlock, oxidized almost beyond recognition, hanging from an equally rusted latch. Dorothy stood before it for a long moment, her hand still closed around the key, her breath visible in the cold air. She thought about Gregory's dismissive expression in the driveway, about Carol's sighing, about Philip's patient, condescending explanation of why she needed to accept a facility placement like a sensible person. She thought about 19 years of faithful tenancy erased in a morning, about Frank's absence and Agnes's silence, and 40 years of carrying something she had never been allowed to put down. Then she stepped forward, fitted the key into the padlock with hands that trembled only slightly, and turned it. The lock opened with a grinding resistance that gave way suddenly, the mechanism releasing after decades with what felt like reluctant surrender. Dorothy gripped the iron handle with both hands, braced her feet against the hillside, and pulled. The door fought her, swollen with moisture, warped by years of weather. It resisted with stubborn heaviness until something gave, and it swung outward with a sound like a long-held breath finally released. Cool air moved over her, earth and old timber and something else, something faint but absolutely unmistakable. Lavender, her mother's scent, the smell Agnes had carried with her always, pressed into the fabric of her clothes and the pages of her books and the rooms she moved through. 40 years sealed inside that hillside, and it was still there, still recognizable, still hers. Dorothy stood at the threshold of her mother's cellar, flashlight in hand, heart pounding with something that was equal parts grief and anticipation, and stepped inside. The cellar was larger than Dorothy remembered, stretching back into the hillside with a curved ceiling of mortared stone and heavy timber beams that had held their shape remarkably well despite the decades. The air inside was cool and still, carrying that deep underground quiet that felt less like silence and more like the absence of the world above. Dorothy swept her flashlight beam slowly across the space, letting her eyes adjust, taking inventory. Shelves lined both walls, rough-cut wood mounted on iron brackets, most of them empty now. A few held the ghostly remnants of Agnes's preserving. Old mason jars clouded with age, their contents long since reduced to unrecognizable sediment. Labels still attached in Agnes's neat bookkeeper's handwriting. Tomatoes, green beans, apple butter. The domestic archaeology of a woman who had spent her life preparing carefully for uncertain seasons. The floor was packed earth, dry and firm, undisturbed by anything larger than the occasional mouse. Cobwebs draped the upper corners in elaborate gray curtains. A wooden stool sat against the left wall beside an empty crate, as if Agnes had simply stepped out one afternoon and would be back shortly to resume whatever quiet work she'd been doing here in her thinking place. Dorothy moved deeper into the cellar, her flashlight cutting through the dimness, and then she saw it. At the very back of the space, pushed against the rear wall, where the ceiling curved lowest, sat a chest. Not large, perhaps 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, but solidly built from dark hardwood with iron corner fittings that had gone the color of dried blood with oxidation. Dorothy recognized it immediately with a recognition that went below memory into something closer to the body's own knowing. Agnes's chest, the one that had sat at the foot of Agnes's bed for Dorothy's entire childhood. The one Agnes had always referred to simply as the box in a tone that communicated clearly it was not to be opened or examined or discussed. Dorothy had never known what was inside it, had asked once at perhaps 9 or 10 years old, and had received from Agnes a look so complete in its "this is not your concern" that she had never asked again. She crossed the remaining distance to it slowly, her flashlight steady, her breath shallow. The chest was sealed with wax, deep red wax applied in a thick, careful band around the entire lid joint, the seal unbroken and remarkably preserved in the cool, dry air of the cellar. Pressed into the wax at the center of the front edge was a small brooch Dorothy recognized instantly. A simple oval cameo in a gold setting, a woman's profile in cream against pale blue. Agnes had worn it every Sunday for Dorothy's entire childhood. Dorothy had watched her pin it to her collar hundreds of times. She had assumed it had been buried with her. The fact that it was here, pressed deliberately into the wax seal of this chest, told Dorothy with absolute clarity that this had been planned, that Agnes had known exactly what she was doing when she sealed this chest and left it here, that this was not the random storage of a woman who simply ran out of time to deal with her possessions. This was an arrangement, a message, a gift prepared with intention and preserved with care across decades for a specific moment that Agnes had somehow known would come. Dorothy set her suitcase down carefully and lowered herself onto the earthen floor in front of the chest, her knees complaining sharply at the descent. She positioned her flashlight against the side wall so its beam fell directly on the chest, giving her both hands free. Then she reached into her coat pocket and withdrew the small folding knife she'd carried for years out of the practical habit of a woman who'd spent decades working with fabric and thread and occasionally needing to cut things cleanly. She broke the wax seal carefully, working around the edge of the lid in sections, preserving as much of it intact as she could out of some instinct she couldn't fully explain. The cameo brooch she removed and held for a moment in her palm, cool and solid and unmistakably Agnes, before placing it gently in her coat pocket beside the iron key. The lid was heavier than expected, solid wood that had not warped despite the years, and it opened smoothly on hinges that had been well made and well oiled before sealing, designed to last. Dorothy lifted it fully and looked inside. The first thing she saw was fabric, ivory-colored, folded carefully in layers of tissue paper that had yellowed at the edges but held together, the fabric itself still possessing a quiet luster that spoke of quality and care. Dorothy reached in with both hands and lifted it gently, and as it unfolded, she understood what she was holding. It was a dress, not just any dress, a dress she recognized with a force that moved through her chest like something physical. A dress she had made herself 40 years ago with her own hands. A dress she had poured every ounce of her skill and hope and longing for a different life into, stitch by careful stitch. A dress she had never worn. The dress from the wedding that Victor Aldridge had destroyed. Dorothy sat on the earthen floor of her mother's cellar holding it, unable for a long moment to breathe or think, or do anything except feel the full crushing weight of 40 years arriving all at once. Agnes had kept it, had taken it somehow. Dorothy couldn't yet imagine how, and had preserved it here with the same careful devotion she had brought to everything she'd ever loved. With hands that shook visibly now, Dorothy turned the dress over, running her fingers along the seams and construction with the instinctive assessment of someone who had spent a lifetime working with fabric. And there, in the lining of the bodice, she felt it, a thickness that shouldn't have been there, a stiffness that didn't belong to the fabric, a section of the lining that had been opened and restitched, not her own work, but Agnes's neat and deliberate hand. Dorothy set the dress across her lap carefully, reached back in her suitcase for her small sewing scissors, and began to cut. The lining fell open, and 3 envelopes slid into her lap. Old envelopes, yellowed with age, addressed in different handwriting to Agnes Calloway. Dorothy picked up the first one with fingers that had gone completely still, the trembling replaced by a focused calm that came from understanding, suddenly and completely, that everything was about to change. The first envelope was postmarked September 1985, addressed to Agnes Calloway in handwriting Dorothy didn't recognize, small and careful. The letters formed with the particular precision of someone accustomed to taking dictation or keeping records. Dorothy opened it with the deliberate steadiness of someone who understood that what they were about to read could not be unread, and unfolded the single page inside. Dear Mrs. Calloway, I am writing this letter because my conscience has made it impossible for me to remain entirely silent, even though I am far too frightened of the consequences to speak this truth publicly where it might actually make a difference. My name is Pauline Decker. I worked as administrative assistant to Victor Aldridge at Aldridge Construction for 11 years, managing his correspondence, his appointments, and the day-to-day operations of his office. I was present on the afternoon in June when Mr. Aldridge called Dorothy into his office for what he described to me as a meeting regarding the Hard Row project, for which she had been contracted to provide interior soft furnishings. I made the appointment myself at his specific request. I was working at my desk outside his office throughout the meeting. The walls between our offices were thin. I heard Mr. Aldridge's voice take on a tone I had heard before, low and particular and insistent in a way that made my stomach tighten with recognition. I heard Dorothy's voice respond, politely at first, then firmly. I heard her say she was not interested, that she was engaged to be married, that she would like to return to discussing the project. I heard him continue. I heard her voice become sharper, more urgent. And then I heard the door open quickly and heard her footsteps moving fast across the outer office and out into the corridor. Mr. Aldridge came out of his office several minutes later. His expression was one I had learned to recognize over 11 years, the tight-jawed, controlled anger of a man who was unaccustomed to not getting what he wanted. By the following morning, he had begun telling people that Dorothy had behaved inappropriately toward him during their meeting. I heard him on the telephone, carefully, methodically dismantling her reputation with people whose opinions mattered in Cedarbrook. I wanted desperately to correct this. I knew what I had heard. But Mr. Aldridge sits on the board of the hospital where my husband works as a facilities manager. One word from Victor Aldridge, and my husband would lose his position. We have 4 children, Mrs. Calloway. I'm a coward and I know it, but I cannot carry this in complete silence. Dorothy Merritt is innocent. Victor Aldridge is a liar who destroyed her reputation because she refused him. I'm so deeply sorry I cannot say this anywhere would matter. Pauline Decker. Dorothy sat with the letter in her hands for a long time before she could bring herself to pick up the second envelope. 40 years. She had known, obviously, that she was innocent. Had known every single day for 40 years exactly what had and hadn't happened in Victor Aldridge's office that afternoon. But knowing something alone, without witness or documentation, without anyone to corroborate or confirm, was a particular kind of loneliness that she had never found adequate words for. Here, finally, was someone else who knew, someone who had heard, someone who had written it down. The second envelope was postmarked October 1985, a different hand entirely. Larger, less careful, the writing of someone more accustomed to signing contracts than composing correspondence. Mrs. Calloway. I'll keep this brief, because I'm not a man who finds letters easy. My name is Howard Brennan. I run Brennan Contracting out of Cedarbrook, and I've done business in this county for 23 years. In late May of this year, I was driving past the Aldridge Construction offices on Cedar Mill Road at approximately 7 in the evening. I had been meeting a client nearby and was taking the back road home. I saw Victor Aldridge following a woman across the parking lot toward her car. I recognized him immediately. I did not at the time recognize her, though I later understood from events that followed that it was Dorothy Merritt. What I witnessed was not ambiguous. He was following her closely while she was clearly attempting to leave quickly. He caught up with her at her car and positioned himself to block her from getting in. I watched him take hold of her arm twice when she tried to move past him. I watched her pull away from him both times. This continued for several minutes before she managed to get into her vehicle and drive away. When a story about Dorothy Merritt began circulating through Cedarbrook, that she had pursued Victor Aldridge inappropriately, that she was a woman of poor character, I understood immediately what had actually happened. A man who had been pursuing a woman who rejected him had simply reversed the story. I have not spoken publicly because Victor Aldridge's company holds contracts with 3 of my largest ongoing clients. If I stand against him openly, I will lose those contracts and possibly my business. My wife is pregnant with our 3rd child. I have made my calculation, and I am ashamed of it. I am sending this to you because I heard you are her mother and because I need someone to know that at least one person in this town saw the truth. I saw what he did. Dorothy Merritt is telling the truth. Victor Aldridge is lying. Howard Brennan. Dorothy folded the second letter slowly and set it beside the first on the earthen floor. 2 witnesses. 2 people who had seen and heard and documented. 2 people who had been too afraid of Victor Aldridge's power to speak publicly, but who had been unable to remain completely silent. She picked up the 3rd envelope with steady hands. Agnes's handwriting on the front, addressed simply in her mother's neat script. For Dorothy, when the time comes. My darling girl, if you have found your way to this cellar, then something has gone very wrong in your life, and I am no longer there to help you face it. I'm so deeply sorry for both of those things. These letters came to me in the autumn of 1985, carried by people whose consciences wouldn't allow complete silence, even when their courage wouldn't allow public speech. By the time they reached me, the damage had already been done. Your engagement to Frank had survived, thank God, but your reputation in Cedarbrook had not. The wedding at First Presbyterian had been canceled. The Aldridge family's connections had ensured that version of events spread through every corner of this county with remarkable thoroughness. You were already known as the woman who had made inappropriate advances toward Victor Aldridge, a story so perfectly constructed and so widely distributed that contradicting it felt almost impossible. I tried. I want you to know that I tried. I made an appointment with Reverend Caldwell at First Presbyterian, intending to present these letters and demand a public correction. Victor Aldridge found out before I could keep that appointment. I still did not know how. He came to my house on a Tuesday evening when I was alone. He was not threatening in a way that involves raised voices or explicit demands. He was far more frightening than that. He sat in my kitchen and told me calmly that if I attempted to use those letters publicly, he would ensure your life in Cedarbrook became genuinely untenable. He would see to it that Frank lost every contract in the county. He would spread stories about you that would make the current rumors seem mild. He told me he had the means and the patience to do all of this, and he said it with the pleasant confidence of someone who knew they were believed. I believed him completely, and so I made the worst decision of my life. I stayed silent. I hid the letters. I sewed them into the lining of your wedding dress, the dress you had made with such love and hope and never gotten aware, and I sealed them in this chest and brought them here to the one place I knew would be safe and private and entirely mine. I told myself I was protecting you. Perhaps I was. Perhaps I was simply too afraid. I will never know for certain, and I have carried that uncertainty every day since. What I know with absolute certainty is this. You were innocent. You did nothing wrong. A powerful and vindictive man destroyed your reputation because you refused him, and an entire town believed him because he was important and you were not. You deserved so much better than what happened to you. You deserved a mother who fought harder. Use these letters, Dorothy. Tell the truth. Make people listen to evidence. It is 40 years late, and I am so sorry for that. But truth does not expire. Justice delayed is still worth pursuing. You were robbed of something real and significant, and the man who robbed you has lived without consequence for far too long. I love you more than I ever managed to say properly. I am sorry I was not brave enough when bravery mattered most. But perhaps even now, even this late, it can still matter. Oh, my love, always. Agnes. Dorothy sat in the cool quiet of her mother's cellar, surrounded by 40 years of preserved truth, and wept. She cried until there was nothing left to cry, until the grief and rage and 40 years of accumulated injustice had poured out of her completely and left her emptied and strangely clear. Then Dorothy Merritt wiped her face with the back of her hand, folded the 3 letters carefully into her coat pocket beside the cameo brooch and the iron key, and sat quietly for several minutes in the cool underground dark, thinking with the particular precision of someone who has finally, after a very long time, decided to act. Victor Aldridge was 62 years old, and still the most powerful man in Cedarbrook. She knew from the occasional fragment of town news that still reached her isolated life that he remained extraordinarily active in community affairs, sitting on the county development board, chairing the annual civic fundraiser, serving as a deacon at First Presbyterian Church, where Dorothy's wedding had been canceled 4 decades ago. He was respected and admired and trusted by virtually everyone in Cedarbrook who mattered. His words still carried enormous weight. Dorothy understood something crucial about what she was planning to do. She could not walk into a room looking defeated. She could not present herself as a homeless, evicted elderly woman with nothing to her name and expect people to listen to her with the seriousness her evidence deserved. Appearance was not vanity, it was strategy. She needed to look like someone whose words carried authority, someone who had arrived with intention and dignity rather than desperation. She examined the dress carefully in her flashlight beam, running her fingers along its construction with the practiced assessment of someone who had spent 40 years doing precise needlework professionally. Agnes had preserved it remarkably well. The ivory fabric still possessed its quiet luster. The delicate embroidered trim along the bodice still held its intricate detail. It was clearly a formal dress, yes, and wearing it to a public confrontation might seem unusual to onlookers, but Dorothy understood the symbolic weight of it. This was the dress she had never gotten to wear because of Victor Aldridge. Wearing it now, to face him publicly, carried a meaning that went beyond theater. She worked through the night by flashlight, her fingers moving with the muscle memory of a lifetime of careful needlework. She removed the formal train entirely, shortening the back hem to a practical mid-calf length. She altered the neckline, raising it slightly to something more austere and authoritative. She removed the decorative sleeves and replaced them with the structured lines of her winter coat, worn open over the dress, which gave the entire ensemble an air of dignified formality rather than bridal ceremony. She found a narrow belt in her suitcase and used it to define the waist cleanly. By the time pale dawn light began filtering through the open cellar door, she had created something she could stand in with complete conviction. She bathed carefully using water from a bottle she'd filled at a gas station the previous afternoon, dressed with deliberate attention, pinned her gray hair into a neat and severe arrangement at the back of her head, and examined herself in the small mirror from her compact. She saw not a desperate woman who had been evicted by her own children and was living in a cellar. She saw someone who had something important to say and the composure to say it. First Presbyterian Church held its monthly community breakfast on the first Saturday of October, a long-standing Cedarbrook tradition where church members and townspeople gathered in the church hall for a shared meal before the weekend's activities. Dorothy knew from years of living in Cedarbrook that Victor Aldridge never missed it. He considered it, she had heard more than once, one of his favorite civic obligations. He would be there at 9 o'clock, surrounded by people who respected and admired him, holding court in exactly the way powerful men did, when they had never once been challenged. Dorothy arrived at the church hall at 8:55, the 3 letters in a cloth bag over her arm, the modified dress under her open coat, her chin level, and her footsteps unhurried. The hall was full. Perhaps 60 or 70 people clustered around tables with coffee cups and plates, conversation filling the warm space with the comfortable noise of a community that believed itself to be decent and well-intentioned. She saw Victor Aldridge immediately. He was standing near the far end of the room beside the coffee station, talking with animated confidence to a small group of men Dorothy recognized as members of the County Development Board. He was tall, well-dressed, silver-haired, projecting the easy authority of someone who had never had meaningful reason to doubt their own standing. He had not yet seen Dorothy. She moved through the room steadily, and people noticed her as she passed. The unusual formality of her dress, the deliberateness of her direction. Conversations paused. Heads turned. By the time she reached Victor Aldridge and stopped directly in front of him, the immediate area had gone noticeably quiet. He looked up, saw her, and in the single unguarded fraction of a second before his social composure reassembled itself completely, Dorothy saw something move across his face that confirmed everything she already knew. He recognized her, and he was afraid. "Mr. Aldridge," Dorothy said clearly, her voice carrying through the quiet that had spread around them like a widening circle. "I have something that belongs to this community, something that is 40 years overdue." She reached into her cloth bag and withdrew the 3 letters. The silence that had spread through the church hall was the particular kind that happens when a room full of people simultaneously understands that something significant and irreversible is occurring. Conversations died completely. People turned from their coffee cups and their plates with the instinctive attention of those who recognize a moment they will be asked about later. Dorothy held the letters clearly visible in her hand and spoke in the steady, carrying voice of someone who had been preparing this moment for 40 years without knowing it. "My name is Dorothy Merritt," she said, addressing the room as much as the man in front of her. "Many of you know me, or knew me once. Some of you will remember a story that circulated through Cedarbrook 40 years ago about a woman who behaved inappropriately toward a respected businessman, who pursued him, who made advances toward a man who was not interested, who was, in the careful phrasing that spread through this town like weather, a woman of poor character." She paused, letting the recognition move through the room, watching faces shift as people placed her, remembered, connected the present woman to the 40-year-old story they'd absorbed as fact. "That woman was me," Dorothy continued. "And that story was a lie told deliberately by the man standing in front of me to protect himself from the consequences of his own behavior." Victor Aldridge's expression had arranged itself into something carefully composed, concerned, slightly puzzled, the performance of a man confronting an unfortunate situation with patient dignity. "Dorothy," he said, his voice carrying the measured authority of long practice, "I understand you've been through a very difficult time recently. Perhaps this isn't the appropriate. I have documented evidence," Dorothy said, cutting cleanly through his redirection. She held up the first letter. "Your former administrative assistant, Pauline Decker, was present in your office building on the afternoon you claim I behaved inappropriately toward you. She heard everything through the office wall. She heard you pursuing me. She heard me refusing you clearly and repeatedly. She heard me tell you I was engaged to be married and leaving. And she heard you, after I left, begin constructing the lie you would tell to destroy my reputation." A sound moved through the room. Not quite a gasp, something more controlled than that, the collective intake of breath from people recalibrating. "She was too afraid of your influence to speak publicly," Dorothy continued. "You sat on the hospital board where her husband worked. So she wrote it down and sent it to my mother instead. Because her conscience wouldn't allow complete silence, even when her courage wouldn't allow public speech." She held up the second letter. "Howard Brennan witnessed you following me to my car in the parking lot of your office building on a May evening in 1985. He watched you corner me. He watched you take hold of my arm twice when I tried to leave. He watched me pull away from you before I could finally get into my car and drive away. This was weeks before you publicly accused me. He documented what he saw and sent it to my mother because he too was too afraid of your business connections to testify openly. Aldridge's composed expression had begun its slow dissolution, the careful architecture of it developing fractures under the weight of specificity. His mouth opened and then closed without producing anything useful. "And this," Dorothy said, holding up Agnes's letter, "is from my mother, who tried to bring this evidence forward 40 years ago, who made appointments with people in this church to present these letters and demand a public correction, and who was visited at her home by you personally, Mr. Aldridge, and told in clear and calm terms that if she challenged your account publicly, you would dedicate yourself to making the remainder of my life completely unbearable." The room was absolutely silent. 60 people watching a 40-year-old lie come apart in real time. "She was frightened," Dorothy said simply. "She was an elderly woman alone, and you were the most powerful man in this county, and she was trying to protect me from worse consequences. So she hid these letters. She preserved them. She left them for me to find when I needed them most." Dorothy looked directly at Aldridge. "And I need them now." The silence stretched. Aldridge stood very still, looking at the letters, looking at the faces turned toward him, looking at Dorothy in the dress he should have recognized and clearly did. Something in his expression shifted, not to remorse exactly, but to the particular exhaustion of a man who has maintained a performance for 4 decades and can feel it finally, irreversibly failing. "Did you lie about me?" Dorothy asked quietly. "Yes or no?" The word came out of him like something long held, finally released. "Yes." His voice barely audible, then steadier, carrying the strange relief of confession long overdue. "I pursued you. You refused me repeatedly. I was angry, and I lied to protect myself. I destroyed your reputation. I have known for 40 years what I did." The room erupted completely. Dorothy stood perfectly still in the center of it, the letters in her hand, 40 years of injustice finally spoken aloud in the hearing of witnesses, and felt something she had almost forgotten the texture of entirely. Justice. Small and imperfect and 40 years late, but real. The aftermath moved faster than Dorothy had anticipated, with a momentum that felt less like events unfolding and more like water finally released from behind a dam that had held for too long. Someone in the church hall had recorded everything on their phone. By Saturday afternoon, the video had spread through Cedarbrook's social networks with remarkable speed. By Sunday morning, it had reached regional news outlets. By Monday, it had been picked up nationally, the headline variations all circling the same essential facts. 74-year-old woman confronts man who destroyed her reputation 40 years ago, produces documented evidence, receives public confession. The comment sections filled with thousands of responses from people who had carried their own versions of unjust accusation, their own decades of uncleared names, their own silent griefs suddenly finding language in Dorothy's story. News crews arrived at Agnes's old property on Monday morning, finding Dorothy in the cellar she had made livable with remarkable practicality. She let them come. She told her story calmly and completely, showed them the letters, showed them the dress, explained the 19 years of faithful tenancy that had ended in eviction and her children's abandonment. She was not performative about it. She simply told the truth in the steady voice of someone who had finally stopped carrying something alone. Victor Aldridge's carefully constructed civic identity collapsed with the particular swiftness of things that have been hollow for a long time. The County Development Board requested his resignation within 48 hours. First Presbyterian Church issued a formal public apology to Dorothy, acknowledging their failure 40 years ago and expressing profound regret for the harm that failure had caused. The charitable foundation Aldridge had chaired for 20 years announced an immediate review of his tenure. People who had shunned Dorothy for decades sought her out to apologize, some genuinely, some out of social calculation. She accepted the genuine ones graciously and declined the rest without ceremony. Her children came to her on Wednesday, all 3 of them together, and Dorothy saw something in their faces she had not seen before. Not guilt dressed as concern, but something rawer and less managed than that. Real shame. The particular kind that comes from having watched your own failures documented and distributed nationally. Gregory spoke first, his voice stripped of its usual boardroom composure. Mom, we need you to know that we understand what we did. Not just the eviction. Everything. Not believing you. Not defending you. Treating you like a problem to be managed rather than our mother. Dorothy looked at her 3 children standing in the entrance of her mother's cellar and felt the full complicated weight of loving people who had failed you profoundly. I know you're sorry, she said. I believe that you are. But sorry doesn't give me back 19 years of being quietly dismissed by my own children. It doesn't give me back the morning you stood in my garden and watched strangers carry my life away in boxes. It doesn't change the fact that I cleared my own name while you watched from the crowd. Carol was crying openly. Tell us what you need from us. Whatever it is. I need you to understand, Dorothy said clearly, that whatever relationship we have from this point forward is not built on your guilt or my need. I don't need rescuing. I need children who treat me with the respect I earned raising them. That's all. And that will require consistent effort over time, not a single Wednesday afternoon apology. She looked at each of them in turn. You are welcome to make that effort. I am willing to see whether you can. A lawyer contacted Dorothy Thursday morning, offering to take her case pro bono after seeing the coverage. Victor Aldridge, facing complete public disgrace and confronted with documented evidence of 4 decades of deliberate defamation, did not contest the civil lawsuit his attorneys advised him he could not win. The settlement was reached within 8 weeks, enough for Dorothy to purchase a small house outright on the quieter eastern edge of Cedarbrook, with 2 bedrooms, good natural light, and a garden space that would take several seasons to become what she wanted it to be. She hung the wedding dress on her living room wall, cleaned and preserved in an archival frame, where it caught the afternoon light and reminded her not of what had been stolen, but of what she had reclaimed. 7 months later, on a warm May morning, Dorothy was in her new garden turning soil for the first planting when Philip arrived at her gate with his teenage son, Marcus, who stood slightly behind his father with the careful watchfulness of an adolescent trying to read the situation correctly. Philip's voice was nervous but genuine. Marcus has been asking about you since everything happened. He said he wants to know the real story. From you directly, not from the news. Dorothy looked at her grandson, 15 years old, eyes that held honest curiosity rather than judgment, and felt something open quietly in her chest. Come in, she said, stepping back from the gate. I'll tell you everything. The complete truth from the beginning. You should know where you come from. You should understand what your grandmother did to preserve the truth and what truth costs and why it is always, without exception, worth the price. Marcus stepped through the gate and looked up at her with the particular attention of someone who understands they are about to hear something important. Dorothy smiled and led him inside, because forgiveness, she had learned, was not the same as forgetting, and rebuilding, she had learned, was not the same as returning to what was. It was something new, constructed carefully from what survived, with patient hands and clear eyes, and the hard-won understanding that dignity, once genuinely reclaimed, belongs to you completely and permanently, and no one, no powerful man, no indifferent child, no town full of people who chose to believe a lie, can ever take it from you again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.